Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special event. This is a CMEpalooza Company Spotlight. I am Scott Kober, the co-producer of CMEpalooza, and I would like to welcome you all to this broadcast entitled Outcomes, Creating Value for All Stakeholders. And this is sponsored by Haymarket Medical Education. So I will introduce my fellow panelists here in a moment, but before we begin, just for folks who are watching this live, please note that there are a few ways you can ask questions during this broadcast. You can use the CMEpalooza text line to send in a question. The number is 267-6660-CME, or you can tweet your question to us using the CMEpalooza hashtag. And I'll be putting this kind of scrolling across the bottom of the screen as we're going along so that you don't have to memorize it now. And so with that, I would like to introduce our panelists for today. So I am joined by Jackie Brooks. Jackie is the Vice President of Medical Affairs at Haymarket Medical Education. In the bottom right-hand corner, it's like Hollywood Squares. I would like to bottom right for the block, I've got Stephen Weber. Stephen is the Vice President of Innovation, Product Development, and Business Strategy for the National Association for Continuing Education, as well as the Executive Producer of NACE's Virtual Symposia. And finally, in your lower left, I've got Annette Schwind. Annette is the Director of Outcomes Assessment and Evaluation for Haymarket Medical Education. So welcome to the three of you, and thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
So this is sort of kind of a very informal conversation, as most of our CMEpalooza sessions are, and we're going to cover lots of questions, lots of issues surrounding outcomes assessment, sort of the value for providers, for supporters, for partners, and issues like that. So I'm just going to start out by throwing out this question here to Jackie. So Jackie, who are the primary stakeholders who benefit from the robust assessment of educational outcomes in continuing professional development? Some probably are pretty obvious, and some might not be so obvious.
Yeah, and I think I'm not going to cover the obvious ones in depth. I mean, obviously, we're looking at CME companies, so MECs, providers in general, and supporters. I mean, it's vital for us to get that outcomes information, not only to demonstrate that CME is effective, but also to demonstrate that we've been effective at doing our jobs and that the dollars that are spent are worth it. So, I mean, it also obviously helps us not only as providers, but as supporters to develop needs data and gap data going forward. So those are the obvious ones. But I think that, we don't really think about how this potentially impacts our partners. And I'm talking about associations, ACOs, medical networks, even government funders, who are looking at those data and may glean information from those data that can help them to seek funding from other sources in the longer term, and also teach them a strategy for moving forward in terms of measuring outcomes that show that, or that demonstrate that what they're doing is worthwhile, so that they can get funding from other sources. And, that's outside of, pharma grant managers, potentially government, insurance providers, that kind of thing. So I think that's really important when we're thinking about it, that, we're designing activities that are, with our partners, that are useful for our partners to take those outcomes further.
So then how do we get our outcomes to some of those stakeholders who, aren't sort of traditionally thought of as consumers of outcomes information from our activities?
So, in my previous life, I was doing a lot of consulting, and, one of the things that we did was we were working with a group that were kind of a peer support group. And we were designing some sort of an educational platform where we could measure outcomes among their patient population to demonstrate positive outcomes that they could potentially utilize moving forward to seek funding in other places.
Okay. So, Stephen, what are some of the steps that providers can take to ensure that they are addressing the outcomes needs of each of these stakeholders?
Well, I think you'll hear me say this a few times. The most important thing that a provider, that a medical education company can do is speak to the supporters, find out how they're utilizing the data, who is going to be utilizing data, who do they need to present the data to, what is the form of reporting that they want, whether it be question by question or by learning objective or by learning domain, depending upon, and then build out your outcomes report, which is what we've done in NACE, to basically meet multiple providers' needs, but then also customize as necessary to providers' needs. One of the big focuses that we've had over the last few years is to really focus in on the educational impact summary and providing that, making that our second slide in all of our outcomes reports, because that slide is the slide that is going to enable the grant managers to be able to put that into their presentations and reports as they move up into the senior management team and to their managers and above their managers when they're presenting the success or the status of their activities. And we believe that it's not only our job to report data, but it's also critical that we're servicing the grant managers specific to their needs, because that allows them to service their stakeholders, which will in turn get our data out in front of all the stakeholders and hopefully lead to continued support on an ongoing basis.
So there's a question, and we've already got questions coming in on the CMEpalooza text line. So this is a question that's sort of relevant to what you were saying. So how much, if at all, do you take into consideration the research and business needs of an individual supporter when developing your outcome strategies and assessment questions for outcomes measurement?
We develop our content from starting with outcomes and working backwards in our needs assessments. We don't focus in necessarily, it's very independent. We don't focus in on business need. We do focus in on reporting needs. And I think that's the big difference. It's what we're going to report is going to be the data that we collect, and we have to make sure that we design that data to measure what we're trying to determine relative to a gap, and whether we're closing that gap or if that gap still exists. So we don't take business needs as much. We're focused in on the education and then collecting data that's going to demonstrate whether we've actually closed gaps and what other gaps have we identified. That is, the business need is not our focus.
Okay. So Annette, I know that the four of us on here and probably some of our audience is familiar with the work of the Outcome Standardization Project over the course of the last 2 years. So maybe if you could kind of, talk a little bit about what this group has done and then talk a little bit from the provider perspective. What is the value of the list of definitions that this group came up with and published?
Sure. Just as a very quick high-level description, the Outcome Standardization Project was a volunteer-led initiative to develop a glossary of terms that would form a common foundation for describing outcomes measurements. And as you mentioned, it's been ongoing the last couple of years. Their first iteration of the glossary was released back in 2018, I believe, and then also published earlier this year in the Journal of European CME. And the idea behind the project is trying to get everybody on the same page with the terminology that we use, because we all tend to use the same words when describing our educational outcomes, but those words can have different meanings for different stakeholders. A good example of that is the word learner. If you asked a dozen different providers and supporters what they mean or what they think that word means, you'd get at least 13 different answers. So the OSP was trying to come up with a common language. It's important to know that right now there hasn't been universal acceptance of those terms, but they are a great starting point. And that's what I think the value for providers is, to take a look at that glossary and start conversations within our own organizations about how we define our outcomes metrics.
Okay, so
sorry, Scott, I wanted to add there that, I think this is a vital project because it's about time we all got on the same page and all started talking the same language, because I think part of the difficulty that we have with outcomes measurements is the fact that we don't have a standard language. And I think these are great initiatives, but I wish everybody would get on the same page finally and come up with these final definitions that we can all utilize internally and externally.
So we have people who are tweeting in questions about how they can access the outcome standardization project definitions and publications. I know that they do have a website with a lot of this information, and we actually have had CMEpalooza sessions with members of the team that are in our archive. So you can probably go in and Google either one of those ways to kind of find the list of their definitions. So Annette, so then how did Haymarket take the outcome standardization project definitions and sort of incorporate them into how you guys assess outcomes, and sort of how can individual providers sort of do their own assessment of how well those definitions fit into what they currently are doing and may want to do differently in the future?
Sure. Well, the first thing Haymarket did, and what I would suggest is the first step for any provider, is take a look at what you can measure. Everybody's got different systems and capabilities, and the OSP does define a lot of terms, but there are metrics outside of that providers may be capturing. So take a look at what you can collect and report and see where that falls compared to the terms that OSP has. Then the next step would be weighing the needs of the people you're reporting to. Stephen was right on the money when he talked about one of our biggest stakeholders who uses our outcomes reports are supporters, and knowing what metrics they're responsible for reporting, what information their teams internally find valuable is going to help you kind of narrow down what you want to measure and report. And the way you find out what's valuable to supporters is talking to them. Some supporters have been very upfront. They have put right on their website or included in their instructions for outcomes the terms that they're using, even templates of how they would like to see information. But there's also just getting on the phone or video chat nowadays and talking to different grant managers and saying, okay, so what do you mean, or what do you want this word to mean? How do you evaluate the outcomes when they come to you? What information can I give you that will help you tell the story about this education to your team there at your organization? And then as providers, we can use this outcomes data to demonstrate success of our own educational activities and feed development of future activities. But I think the most important thing as you take all these factors into consideration is making sure you meet your needs as a provider and how you're going to meet the requirements of your supporters as well.
Okay, so a couple of questions that have just come over the text line. So what about initiatives that are multi-funded by multiple supporters who may have different definitions of specific terms? How do you deal with that in developing an outcomes report?
Sure. Well, what I found in my conversations with the different grant managers are very few of them, and there are a few of them who have put out, these are the definitions we're using. Most of them, their feedback to me was, whatever terms you use, be sure to define them so that we know what you mean by them. And then they do the work on their end of, okay, I understand what that is, and that compares, across different types of providers. In the end, though, if you have multi-support and two different providers have said, I want you to define your terms this way, it may come down to you doing the work of separate reporting for those different organizations. And it's a lot of work. It's not easy, but that's the reality, because in the end, if you don't provide the information that supporter needs, you're not doing yourself any good, because you're not communicating the success of your programming.
So then what are some of the commonalities you've heard from supporters as far as specific metrics that are most important to them? What sorts of things kind of come across frequently in your conversations?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's such a wide spectrum of needs and requirements across the grantors that I've spoken with. Everything from, we're really just happy with what you send us, and we'll take that and make of it what we want to, you know what, I think the most valuable is data from people who went all the way through and claimed credit. Those are the only people who I think are really engaged, and that's what I want to look at. So trying to amalgamate all of that together, I would say most grantors have communicated, or the ones I've communicated with, have said they're looking for data from learners who have engaged with the activity, not just hit a landing page or, heard about an activity through an email. Folks who went in and answered questions, and you can track some of their involvement within the activity. Tell us what happened. How did that activity influence their knowledge, their competence, or their performance? What data did you get from those individuals? And then, more than just these metrics, it's important to provide interpretation. What do those numbers mean? Because that's what's going to give those numbers value. And that's what's going to help grant manager, or really any stakeholder, tell the story of the education. How did this education make a difference in what clinicians know and what they do? And why was that a good investment for a supporters organization? Interpreting the data is what's going to tell them that. And I think, Jackie, you have some really good insights about how stating clinical implications of the outcomes is really valuable as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I've always worked in an environment where the medical team and the outcomes team have paired up to interpret the data that we have. Because I think there's some nuances clinically that may not be interpretable from the data from the perspective of the outcomes person. I mean, I'm certainly not going to argue that the outcomes person will be able to understand the data better. But from a clinical perspective, there's some nuances of interpretation that I think are really critical. And I'm a huge proponent of making sure that I'm involved in the outcomes, just so that I can find those little pieces of information that are so valuable to supporters in terms of planning their strategies moving forward and helping us to plan ours moving forward.
So then what kinds of things can help providers ensure that the data that they're reporting is accurate? Obviously, with all the online platforms we're using these days, we're getting more and more numbers, more and more information. How do you figure out what data is relevant, what might not be so relevant, and as well, what data is truly representative of the learner population that is accessing your education?
Well, as Jackie alluded to, what we do at HME is there's a team that's involved with these outcomes reports. It's not just me or the couple of folks who work with me in outcomes in a silo. We do use our clinical folks and the business development leads and the program managers all to review and contribute to these reports so that we're getting the full picture. It's also a way of double checking everybody's work. The numbers aren't just, hey, Annette told me what the numbers were, so I'm going with that. We do have a QC where somebody double checks me to make sure that there's an accurate representation of the data. And then something else HME did just recently was engage a third party to audit our entire outcomes process, everything from the software and platform we use to collect the data, how that data is then processed and analyzed, and how it gets reported in kind of the final product there. And after several months and a lot of deep dives into technical things that I confess I don't understand about how computers work, and every step of the process from when I'm downloading that data and moving it through our team, very proud to say that our outcomes process was certified as conforming to all industry standards and best practices. So we can say with a surety that these outcomes you can trust. This accurately represents what happened, and be able to feel that there's nothing that we left out or unturned, and you're getting the real deal, the real picture. Now, I know not every provider can invest the resources in doing something like that, but certainly you can have your own process within your organization of someone who comes along and double checks those numbers, someone who comes along and helps craft the clinical interpretation. What do these data mean? So that you, to the best of your own ability, are providing the fullest picture.
Okay. So we have a bunch of questions coming in about this audit, as I expected we would, because it's not something that I had not heard of before. So what sort of organization was this that came in to do the audit? What kind of things did it involve? And what exactly is that certification that you got from them?
Okay, great. The organization that did the audit is BPA Worldwide, and they are a not-for-profit assurance service provider. They began, it's my understanding, doing audience verification for publications. So part of their business is making sure that who a publication says they are reaching, they are actually reaching. They then branched out into technical services. So that would be the part of this where they were looking at our systems. And again, they did a deep dive. There were many conversations that I listened in on, did not understand half of it because it was all computer speak. But it was about, is the data that you're getting secure? Are you, how are you collecting that data from the learners, and what happens to it inside of your system? And then my part of working with them is showing them step by step. Okay, I download the data here. This is how I match up pre and post results. This is the type of formula we use to calculate, the changes and effect size. And this is how I take all of that information and I put it into a report. This is represented here, that's represented there. And, they did a spot check of several examples of recent reports where they took the raw data, did the calculations, made sure that what was in our reports matched what they were finding. And yeah, it's a pretty intense process. It's not the only process, but it's the one that we used. And at the end, we were given a letter and saying that we were certified. They call it I Comply. It's the name of their certification. And so we include that with our information about outcomes.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So Jackie, let's sort of take a step back for a second and talk a little bit about prospective versus retrospective analyses of outcomes data. First of all, what are these? Why are they different? And why are they both potentially important for providers of continuing medical education?
So this is one of my pet ideas, projects that I've worked on in the past, and I've seen it work. I know that it works. I mean, I think retrospective data analysis is what we do standardly. We develop a program, we look at the outcomes from the program, we utilize those outcomes to then make decisions about education moving forward. With prospective data planning, we're looking at longer term analyses where you would essentially propose multiple interventions throughout, say, a period of time, say a year, where you could actually plan to deliver education based on the gaps identified, and then take those gaps, analyze those gaps as the education is happening, and then either adapt that education or design new education to specifically look at those gaps. So, I've done this in the past where you can actually see certain gaps narrow, new gaps emerge because of what is happening in the environment, like new data coming out or new guidelines being published. But it's really an interesting iterative process, because what you could see is not only improvements in the same cohort as you move forward over time, and those improvements are generally bigger than the ones that you would see from retrospective analyses, but also this capacity to really, analyze all of your different gaps and see how they grow and change over time. And, your improvements are far more significant. So you could do it by cohort analysis. And if you plan very well, you may find a group of people that you can get to buy in to doing a series of programs over time and analyze what they're doing. So, then you would have specific data based on multiple interventions and see how that impacts the learner's knowledge and competence, and ultimately behavior change inside the practice. So I'm a huge proponent of that, and I wish that more supporters would think about supporting larger, longer-term programs so that we can design these kinds of programs and really make a difference. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen very much in our industry, and I think that's something that we really should be fighting for more and educating people about more.
Okay. So is this the same? This is another question that came in, and I'm going to let you take this one. Is this the same as a formative analysis, sort of an agile approach to outcomes?
I think that I might let Annette answer that question, but I think so, yes. I mean, I'm not an outcomes person. I'm a little bit of a geek, but yeah, I mean, Annette, do you want to cover that?
No, absolutely. I would agree. It is formative assessment, and being agile is a great way to describe it. But I think it's also a very exciting way to look at outcomes. Yet, as Jackie points out, these types of larger initiatives, really, we don't get as many chances to do them as we would like.
Okay. So how much do you guys use standardized forms to kind of sort of ease your outcomes reporting data, or to and kind of make things a little bit easier for your team when you're reporting data from 10, 15, 20 different initiatives in the course of a month?
So, I'll start with on that one. At NACE, we actually have a lot of standardization, and we've defined protocols from beginning to end within our outcomes process that involve standardizing in different forms, whether it be our evaluation, whether it be our 4-week post-curriculum assessment. And at NACE, this year we'll do between 35 and 40 4 to 8 hour virtual symposia on the live side. So we have a protocol that we define for our live outcomes, and this has been it changes consistently based upon supporter feedback, based upon what's occurring in the marketplace. And we actually partner with Real CME on most of our outcomes, which also provides a lot of standardization around forms and practices and protocols. One particular example of the benefit of going with a standardized approach has to do with our post-curriculum assessment. It was back in 2017, I revamped the way that we surveyed 4 weeks following each live activity. And we used to get in the range of maybe a 5 to 10% response rate at best of per live activity. By basically really working on the design of the survey and implementing it in a way so that we could ask we ask every single question. It's a pre-post PCA match. So we went every question we asked in the pre-post, we asked in the 4-week follow-up. We've been able to, with a goal of raising our response rate to over 20%, we have been able to actually get it up to around, on average, 30% at this point. And for us, that's critical because when you think about the number of learners that we're reaching right now on average about 1,000 learners per symposium, virtual symposium, for instance. Having 300 people responding to a post-curriculum assessment 4 weeks later, along with the 900 match sets or 1,000, or probably about 700 match sets within an individual activity, being able to pull that through on a match basis, you need that 30% response rate because you're probably going to see maybe 20% are matched. And at 20%, we have powerful enough ends so the data is meaningful, it can be acted upon. So that's a really good example. In terms of we really standardize that process, we standardize how we laid out our 4-week follow-up, and it's had a dramatic impact on our measurement as well as on our reporting, and as well as a result on the business.
Great. Okay, we've got a bunch of questions that have come in, and I know we're kind of at right about 30 minutes, but I want to get to some of these questions before we signed off. So first of all, someone did ask, is this session financially supported by Haymarket and NACE? And yes, this is a CMEpalooza Spotlight. So yes, this is financially supported by these organizations, but we hope that it's sort of also beneficial from a broader educational perspective. So a couple of questions that came in. What are your thoughts on the value of in-depth outcomes data from a small group of learners versus analyses of less robust outcomes from a larger learner audience?
Well, from my perspective, I think you may be able to learn different things from a smaller group if you can go more in depth, especially if you have the opportunity to collect qualitative data from those folks and really dive into things like attitudes and barriers, things that affect the way clinicians practice, but aren't as obvious from, let's say, a straightforward multiple choice pre-post question, or even a survey question about those sorts of things. You know, you find out more from talking to someone and listening and hearing what isn't said than you do anything that you can get on paper. So if you have the opportunity to do those sorts of investigations, I think they can be really valuable. You do have to keep in mind, though, that it is valuable information about the set of people that you've involved. You can do as much as possible to make sure they're representative of a larger population, but you need to be real careful if you're going to try to extend your findings and say that they apply to all clinicians.
Okay. So I think someone from the Outcome Standardization Project chimed in. Their website, just for anyone who wants to go to it, is outcomesinCME.org. Hold on, let me look, make sure that I get it right. OutcomesinCME.org, yes. So one last question. So while there may be, universal or some acceptance of the definition of a learner in other terms, some platforms are not able to measure exactly how far into activities learners went, especially on text-based initiative. Do you have any tips for how to measure a learner better on text-based activities?
Well, this goes back to knowing what you can report and making sure you communicate that to anybody who is reading your reports. I know that there are differing capabilities, and yes, on something that's text-based, if you're not tracking page views and things like that, you may not know how far in they get. On the other hand, I do know, having worked with different web developers, some are able to put in at least kind of milestones, so you know how many people get past a certain page, so you can get some idea. So the tip I guess I have is find out from your web folks what they can do, and then whatever you are capable of, be very transparent about that. Say, you know, I can tell you this much and this much, and work with your supporters if they require more, then finding out what resources you'd need to bring in that you don't have right now in order to do that.
All right, great. Any final thoughts that you guys want to share? Any good holiday recipes that you want to pass along?
Annette was going to sing, actually, from what I remember.
Oh, but we've run out of time. Darn.
Oh, darn.
Okay.
Scott, nice to see you again.
Yes, thank you,
for the
Scott.
opportunity.
Great. Well, thank you to Jackie and Stephen and Annette, and thank you to the Haymarket Medical Education family. And for those folks who have watched and chimed in, we got a lot of good questions today. So people will be hearing more information about CMEpalooza 2021 in the next few weeks. Derek and I are actually going to be having a socially distanced meeting tomorrow to kind of talk about the plans for the year. So please keep an eye out on our blog for more information soon. And with that, thanks to everyone here. Thanks to everybody watching, and have a happy and safe holiday.
You too.
Thank
Thank you.
Bye-bye.